afternoon. You're watching Channel 3 News. I'm your host, Hunter Smith. Today, we will be discussing two floods, the Red River flood and the Central Georgia flood. I will be joined by two guests, Paul Bradley Jr. and Brandon Hunter, who will be giving us more information on these two floods. Hi, Paul. How are you today?
I'm great.
Could you please give us a little bit of background on the Central Georgia flood?
Why, yes, I can. Many areas of the Central Georgia experienced devastating effects from the tropical storm Alberta. In July of 1994, heavy rains fell, causing 6 feet of water to accumulate in some locations. Macomb, Mazuma, and Albany were three locations that were submerged by waters of the flood. Many buildings and communities, schools, roads, historic infrastructures, and railroad tracks were completely destroyed. As many as 33 deaths occurred during the effects of the flood. Around 500 residents of Macomb County were evacuated, but many people in all three locations were left trapped in their homes and nowhere to go. Within these areas, the flood caused 175 roads to be closed, leaving people with limited ways to evacuate the dangerous locations. Along with this destruction, 100 dams were broken in 43 counties in Georgia were declared to be federal disasters, and 7 more counties were considered to be state disaster areas. Estimated damage was thought to be around $1 billion, worth as highways, water systems, crops, homes were submerged.
That's very interesting, Paul, and I know that there are a lot of factors that contribute to these sort of floods. Why don't you tell us about a few of the primary and natural causes that contributed to the Central Georgia flood?
Some of the primary and natural causes are definitely the tropical storm Alberta because of the excessive rain. Ocklawaha River and Flint River Basin overflowed by the rising level due to the rainfall that resulted in 20 inches of rain of water overflow. The Central Georgia landscape is very flat, so water just sat on the land, basically. Those are definitely some of the primary and natural causes.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I remember you saying that there were about 6 feet of water. That's a lot of water.
Yes,
and I know also that there can be human-induced factors that contribute to natural disasters like this. Were there any that contributed to the Central Georgia flood?
Yes, definitely in Macon County, levees showed man-made weaknesses and broke. Human reconstruction of the land, killing vegetation, which did soak up some of the water. And people could have reinforced levees and dams and make sure that they were prepared for such instances.
Yes, that makes sense. And for all of our viewers out there, do you have any recommendations for if anything like this ever happened to them, or what the people in Georgia could have done to better prepare themselves?
Yes, I would say that all homeowners and business owners should purchase flood insurance for sure. Survey facts about the topography of the land before building on it, definitely. Evacuate as soon as you are told to prevent being trapped in your home. Monitor the rainfall, the storms, and river levels, and people who live around the rivers, they should definitely pay attention to the level of the river during this time. I would say request the federal government to come to help during the instances such as these, as far as coming out as soon as it happens, not waiting maybe 2 or 3 months later. Have funds set aside, just as well as the federal government, but also the residents of this area should also have money set aside, have an evacuation plan just in case things of this nature should happen.
Well, thank you very much for telling us about the Central Georgia flood. It's been very insightful.
Yes, it's been my pleasure being here.
Thank you. For this next segment, I will be joined by geologist who hails from North Dakota, Brandon Hunter. He will be telling us a little bit about the Red River flood that occurs in North Dakota. Brandon, how are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the Red River flood?
Well, you see, the Red River flood is a flood that happens frequently in North Dakota to Canada. It's more of the winter ice and snow melting, causing the river to overdo its banks and flood.
Now, Brandon, you said this flood occurs frequently. How often would you say that this happens?
Well, this is an annual event. It happens around the spring season when all the snow is melting in the Dakotas. So that's just about the time it happens.
But it doesn't always happen every year?
It does happen every year. Every year is different with the amount of snow they get and the amount of snow coming from the mountains that start to melt.
Okay. Now, why don't you tell us about a few of the natural and primary causes that lead to this flood?
Some of the natural and primary causes would be the ice melting would be a big major one, because the snow that the Dakotas get in the wintertime, it all builds up. It's up to the amount of snow that really determine how much flooding is going to happen. Once that snow starts to melt in the March-April area and the rain starts falling, that helps rise the level of the river and it gets out on the banks. Another would be the flat land around the river. It's all flat land. There's not really a valley. The gradient like 5 inches throughout the river, and it gets to a point where it's at 1.5, which, you know, that's creating that bowl to make the water sit and not go anywhere. Also on that flat land, the clay. The segments under the land is clay, so there's not any any soaking of the water going on. It's just sitting on top of the land.
And I know, like we talked about in the Central Georgia flood, there can be human-induced causes. What are some of the causes that happen in North Dakota that lead to the worsening of the flood?
Some of them would have to be the building around the river and then getting rid of the vegetation. Once you get rid of that vegetation, that also stops the soaking of the water. So the water's not being soaked up by any of the trees and any of the segments. It's just all sitting there.
I know when I've heard about the Red River flood, I've heard various things about something called ice jams. Could you tell us a little bit about what those are?
Ice jams are basically where all this ice is starting to melt and crack, and it's all building up, like the jams are building up back to back. So once that happens, you have this water being held behind the ice. And once these break and crack, that causes the water to flow like basically a dam breaking. So the water is flowing back through all at once, causing the flood to happen sudden, and there's no kind of evacuation or kind of thing.
It sounds like the Red River flood has a lot to do with the ice and the snow in the North Dakota area. But could you tell us a little bit about what the people who live in these areas could do to better prepare themselves?
One thing they should do is not live around the river. Try to move away from the river in the floodplain. Also, is have flood insurance to be on the safe side to protect at least your property, because once that flood comes in, things are going to get damaged because each year it varies. Another thing is to check into the government to see if they have any type of drainage system in the area to drain the water out instead of letting it sit on that clay. Also, you may want to try to do is get people together and create a group to start creating that vegetation again. Get that vegetation back around the river so the water has a place to soak up and the trees can take into the water.
Okay, well thank you very much. Thanks for coming on the show and telling us about the Red River flood.
Anytime.
It's been very interesting. Now that we've heard from both of our geologists, Paul and Brandon, we're able to compare and contrast these two floods. We know that there are some similarities in both of the floods, that the lack of vegetation reduces the amount of water that can soak into the ground, which leaves it to stand on the ground, which also contributes to the flatness of the land in both places. It contributes to the water just sitting. Another thing is that they both have rivers that overflow. In the Red River it's a little worse, but in Georgia we have the Ocmulgee and the Flint rivers that can both contribute to the flooding. Also, there were two things in Macon. There was a levee that broke, and in North Dakota there are the ice jams that broke, and both of these things contribute to the amount of water that flows through to the rest of the ground. But there were some differences too. We know that in central Georgia, the tropical storm Alberta had a lot to do with the flooding and the amount of water that was there, while in North Dakota it's just an annual ice melt. Another thing though is we heard from both of our geologists the things that you at home can do to prepare for floods, and people in Georgia and North Dakota in the instance of these floods reoccurring would be to get flood insurance and also to have an evacuation plan. And now for a closer look at the Red River and Central Georgia floods, we have some pictures and maps to illustrate what we've been discussing.
For you, 'cause we'll never really know what you went through that day, and we'll never really know all the right words to say, and we'll never really know why this took your life away, but it broke down my walls, and it helped me to change. Yes, it broke down our walls. I hope we will change.
And that's our show for today. I hope you learned a little bit about the Red River and Central Georgia floods. I'm Hunter Smith. Thanks for watching Channel 3, and until next time, stay dry.